I am so excited and proud to welcome you all to Big Johnny D History. This will now be a channel where I react to historical content and add bits and pieces that the historical content leaves out, or just learn something new. We can all learn together. I am so excited, and I thought with no better place to start than with what is perhaps the best history channel on YouTube, with Oversimplified. And we are going to be discussing their Napoleonic Wars series, starting with part 1. If there is any area of history I would consider myself to be an expert in, and even with this being my best area of history, I would still use that term loosely. There's still a bunch more that I could learn, but I would consider it to be the Napoleonic era. Napoleon, the Napoleonic Wars, everything surrounding it. So I thought no better place to start than here. No more talking. Without further ado, we're going to jump right into it.
Okay, Mrs. Bonaparte, this is it. One last push, and we're done. Congratulations, it's a general. Oh, and here comes the rest of the army now. Did you just say the rest of the army?
Oversimplified is so great. What I love about Oversimplified is that they add these comedic elements to the video, because obviously this isn't how Napoleon's birth actually went, but they add these comedic elements to the video to make history consumable to the masses. Because a lot of people, when you talk about something that's over 200 years ago at this point, being Napoleon's birth and the whole Napoleonic Wars, it's going to be difficult to get them invested. But when you add this comedic element to it, it really hooks people in. And that's something great that Oversimplified does. And by the way, their animation is impeccable. I believe it's just one person who does it. But to get into the actual history of this, a lot of people don't know this, but Napoleon wasn't born with the name Napoleon Bonaparte. Almost, very close, but not quite. He was actually born with the name Napoleone Bonaparte. Napoleon was Corsican at birth. I believe France had just absolved it into its country about a year before Napoleon's birth. So Napoleon was just barely born French and was never able to shake his Corsican accent. Eventually, he changed his name from Napoleone Bonaparte to Napoleon Bonaparte to make it sound more French. So Napoleon successfully assimilated into the French culture. The horse with the cross eyes, nice.
History is full of great conquerors, many with very impressive origin stories. For example, Alexander the Great was the son of a king. Julius Caesar came from an aristocratic family that descended from a goddess. Great conquerors don't usually come
nice
from
demonetization symbol
families.
because we couldn't show that. We could not show any sort of nudity. We can show war, blood, and guts, but you show that and you're done on YouTube. But that brings me up something about history that I've always found fascinating. If you look at Alexander the Great, if you look at Napoleon, if you look at the man with the silly mustache that led Germany in the 1940s, they're not born in the countries that they're most predominantly known to have led. Napoleon, not really French, kind of Italian, kind of Corsican. Alexander the Great, born in Macedonia, not Greece, even though he's known for leading the Greeks. The man with the silly mustache that YouTube won't allow me to say, born in Austria, not Germany. I always thought that was extremely fascinating, that a lot of these leaders that we so commonly assume and associate with the country that they led, rightfully so, because they are the countries that they led, are actually from different countries. Funny how that works. You could even say George Washington. George Washington wasn't American. He's British.
Living on impoverished islands. But as it just so happens, that is where our story begins. In the early 18th century, the island of Corsica was a part of the Republic of Genoa, until one day Corsica said, hey, we're declaring independence, and it's probably not worth your time to try and stop us. So Genoa said, you're right, it isn't worth their time. Hey France, you want to buy this island? And France said, sure thing. And thus, Corsica became France, just in time for Napoleon to be born French.
1 year prior to his birth.
Many Corsicans didn't appreciate their new conquerors, however, and from an early age, Napoleon developed some fairly anti-French sentiments. Napoleon's dad, however, quickly embraced his new French overlords, which created some tension between dad and son. Ooh, look.
That's funny that it would create tension between Napoleon and his father, who's named Carlo Bonaparte. And that's funny that it would create tension. Napoleon didn't know where he was going to head in the future. He always had a rebellious attitude and actually associated with the Jacobins during the time of the French Revolution after the toppling of the Bastille, Marie Antoinette, the stuff that most of us know about. But Napoleon himself went on to lead his book says French for Dummies. A little tidbit to notice right there. But Napoleon gets mad at his father for assimilating into the French culture and accepting the reality of the situation that their rulers are now French. Napoleon obviously went on to lead the French, so he eventually accepted it because he knew that's where the power lied. And that's something that Napoleon, from a very young age, was very smart at noting where the political wind was blowing. And you can kind of get the vibes that maybe he got this from his father, Carlo, just based on the fact that he assimilated with French culture.
I'm Dad. I wear powdered wigs and silver-buckled shoes, and I'm a traitor to the Corsican people. Go to your room, Napoleon. No, you go to your room, Dad.
Napoleon never did wear the powdered wigs,
Okay.
though.
On the other hand, Napoleon adored his mother, who was definitely the disciplinarian of the family. And even though she would punish Napoleon severely, he kind of respected that. But Napoleon's parents wanted the best for their family. And since they were of very minor nobility, they were able to have Napoleon sent off to the shining lights and rat-infested sewage puddles of the big city. Napoleon went to military school in France. Okay, Napoleon, why don't you introduce yourself to your new classmates? Well, I'm Napoleon, and I hate all of you. Your farts smell like cheese, you can't pronounce the letter R, all you do is go on strike, and you call eggs oofs like a bunch of big dumb idiot dingleberries. Okay. Thanks, Napoleon. I hope you like being bullied. And bullied he was. They picked on him for his Corsican accent, his family's lack of wealth, and it probably didn't help that he also had a bit of a chip on his shoulder. But
he had a chip on his shoulder, which ended up being very useful in the future. But it's funny, you hear him getting bullied for this Corsican accent, his humble upbringings, because even though they said Napoleon was a minor nobility, it was just that, a minor nobility. And at the time Napoleon went to military school, I believe people that were a minor nobility or commoners were not able to rise past the rank of sergeant in the French military. Obviously, the French Revolution comes along and allows Napoleon to excel as he takes advantage of all of his, opportunities, proves himself. But the one thing they mentioned that Napoleon didn't get bullied for was his height, because Napoleon, contrary to popular belief and the British propaganda that was spread at the time, Napoleon was actually pretty average for his time, maybe even a little bit above average. If you look at his height versus some of the other great leaders, off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact height of Emperor Francis I, the leader of Austria at that time, or Alexander I, or, the other world leaders, but I believe he was taller than some of them.
hold his own, and on an average day, might be found dishing out ratatouille sandwiches for breakfast. He spent much of his time alone, and he loved reading about the great conquerors of history. He
Caesar's cookie recipe.
And he wondered if one day he too might have a pizza franchise named after him. He excelled at math and geography, and when he graduated
Little
at the
Caesar's
age of
great,
16,
by the way.
he was made second lieutenant in an artillery regiment. Now, second lieutenant might sound pretty sweet to a screw-up like you, but Napoleon had a little something called ambition. Stonks of it. And he
Maybe
wasn't
too
content
much.
being just some junior officer. He wanted to rise the ranks. Unfortunately for him, that would be a little difficult. Well, Napoleon, I've reviewed your application. It's clear you're very skilled and would be a perfect fit for the promotion. And Simeon, you're just about the biggest idiot I've ever seen. Your test results suggest you have the mental aptitude of a senile earthworm, and in the part of the form where you list your experience, you seem to have drawn a picture of a gerbil giving birth to a shoe. But your dad is the Marquis de la Fufayette, so you get the job. French society was just too closed off. Positions were handed out based on nobility, not talent, and the young Napoleon probably felt stuck. Wouldn't it?
And this is something that you're going to see throughout the rest of Europe at this time. And this is why I believe, on top of Napoleon's military genius, possibly, perhaps, the greatest military leader of all time, it's because French society, after the revolution, was picking from the best of the best. And you see that through a lot of Napoleon's marshals, Marshal Davout, Marshal Ney, Marshal Murat. All of these guys were not meant to be in these positions, but because French society, and they had quite a high population for Europe at that time, I believe they were the most populous country of Europe, maybe second to Russia. But because they were choosing from this massive pool of people, they were able to have a meritocracy that promoted the best of the best, while the rest of European society, and you're going to see this throughout a lot of the wars that Napoleon gets into, it's the son of this guy who's leading it, it's the stepson of this guy, it's this guy's nephew, it's the prince, it's whoever, because they only promoted royalty and people who had connections, as opposed to the French society that pointed the literal best of the best of a population of well over, I believe, 30 million at the time. So that's why France had such a major advantage. Even when Napoleon wasn't on the battlefield, I believe you see this in the War of the First Coalition. Before Napoleon got involved, France started to win, even though they were at war with basically the entire continent of Europe. So that's why France was so successful, on top of having probably the greatest military leader of all time in Napoleon.
If, say, a revolution came along and changed all of that. Well, what are the chances? The French Revolution is here. Bastille toppling, head chopping, king popping. The revolution promised to do away with the old social hierarchy and make everyone a little more equal. Napoleon may not have cared much for the violent mobs, but if it meant he could rise the ranks, he was in. He began fighting to defend the revolution. He put down a British-sponsored counter-revolution in Toulon and got promoted. He put down a royalist uprising in Paris and got promoted. And as his military prowess became more recognized, he was even given
Toulon is commonly known as Napoleon's first military expedition, the first thing that he was involved in that actually involved military. I don't believe that's true. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below. Excuse me. But him putting down the uprising in Paris is where you commonly hear the quote, "a whiff of grape shot," where Napoleon first worked with one of his most loyal marshals, Marshal Murat, and put down that counter-revolutionary revolt in Paris. And that's where the famous whiff of grape shot quote comes from.
Very own army. It was astonishing progress for such a young man of humble origins, and Napoleon's wildest dreams were coming true. But Napoleon also believed he could increase his social status if he married an older rich lady. And so around this time, Napoleon went on the prowl. However, if some sources are to be believed, he was a verified
Napoleon was so ugly, an overall sickly effect was created by his thinness and yellow complexion. I don't know who Laurie Perman is, but that's kind of mean. I wonder if Napoleon persecuted her when he became dictator.
He reportedly had terrible luck with women, and most wanted nothing to do with him. Fortunately, he eventually met Josephine, an aging single mother who was deeply in debt and needed stability, so she agreed to marry him despite finding him intensely disgusting. Napoleon, you dirty dog, you've done it.
And I am so disappointed with the Ridley Scott movie Napoleon. I had such high hopes. I thought it would be so cool to see these Napoleonic battles recreated using modern technology. They could have made them look so astonishing and been so true to history. But the movie is basically out to make Napoleon look like a simp for his wife Josephine. And the reality is Napoleon was in love with Josephine. Josephine never really seemed to be in love with him. I do believe at a certain point that she was, but she constantly cheated on him. When he went to Egypt, Josephine cheated on him. Napoleon heard about it in Egypt. And in the movie, they basically make it seem like Napoleon abandoned all of his men in Egypt just because he found out Josephine was cheating on him and he wanted to go sort things out. That is absolutely not true. Napoleon abandoned his men in Egypt because Admiral Horatio Nelson, the Horatio Nelson, sunk all of his ships and basically left him stranded there. Even after that, Napoleon stayed for another 9 months after learning about Josephine cheating on him. So this idea that they perpetuate in the movie is so disingenuous and so disappointing. If you want to see a real Napoleon movie, I highly recommend you watch 1979's Waterloo. It's free to watch on YouTube. Maybe one day I'll react to it on the channel. Actually, I probably will. But I highly recommend you watch that because there's no CGI. All the guys you see in that movie are actual people. They show you the square battle formations that they use to deflect cavalry. They show you the actual tactics, as opposed to in Ridley Scott's movie where Napoleon is riding on a horse with a sword pointed and all of his men, they just clash each other. Like, Waterloo proves that when you're doing an adaptation of real life history, you don't have to make it disingenuous to make it interesting. And Ridley Scott clearly missed the memo.
Unbeknownst to Napoleon, however, Josephine had a bit of a promiscuous reputation. Hey Napoleon, I hear you're marrying Josephine. Boy, she sure is a great kisser. That's right. Hey, wait, what do you mean she's a great kisser? Hey Hugo, you hear Napoleon's marrying Josephine? Wow, she sure is a great kisser. Now hang on just a minute. Hey everyone, Napoleon's marrying Josephine. Oh yeah, she sure is a great kisser. She's real good at kissing. Wow, I'm pretty sure I kissed her just yesterday. Oh, for goodness sake, is there anyone here who hasn't kissed my wife? Yeah, you.
Oh.
As Napoleon fell madly in love with his new wife,
Napoleon
she
should have seen
fell
the writing
madly
on
in
the
love
wall.
with a man named Hippolyte. It wouldn't be long, however, before Napoleon would...
And I apologize, I'm pausing it so much, but I just have so much to add. Hippolyte, when Napoleon wanted his wife to see him on campaign, Josephine, actually brought Hippolyte with her to go and see Napoleon. That's how big of a cheater she was, that she brought the person that she was cheating on Napoleon with to the battlefield when she went to go see Napoleon.
home and go to war, because while France was having its revolution, tensions in Europe were rising. Hey Austria, you'll never guess what we just did. What's that, France? I got 2 words for you. Revolution. We totally just socked it to our monarchy. What? Dude, the rest of us are monarchies. You've just totally threatened the balance of power in Europe. Now we have to worry about our stinky peasants rising up against us. I mean, holy hell, your queen is... Okay, France, this is pretty awkward. And the rest of Europe is probably itching to give you a wedgie. But you're not ready for a war yet. So you gotta be cool, man. It's absolutely crucial that you say something to defuse the situation right now. Preposterous! I declare war. Suck!
France had some guts. They had some major cojones to declare war on Austria. And that's why people would call me a little bit of a Napoleon defender, I guess. And there was things that he did, like the Peninsular War in 1809, as well as his invasion of Russia, that were completely out of line and mainly wars of aggression. But the first 4 coalition wars, Napoleon had nothing to do with them starting. The first coalition, all the other powers see that France had a revolution and they go, well, we don't want our peasants rising up against us, so we have to put this down, show that it's unacceptable. Same thing with the war of the second coalition. And the third and fourth coalition wars were mainly sponsored by Britain. If Britain hadn't been pouring tons of money to the other European countries, then those wars wouldn't have started. It's only when you get to the 6th coalition, the Peninsula War and the invasion of Russia, is it actually Napoleon being the aggressor. But maybe at that point, he's seen it as his only way of survival. So people can call me a Napoleon defender all they want, but the reality is the rest of Europe was just as, if not more aggressive than he was. You can even see that before Napoleon and this whole situation with France started, when you had the partitions of Poland, basically taking it off the map, literally taking it off the map in a series of partitions, because the other countries were so obsessed with expansionist greed, most notably Austria, Russia, and a slew of other European powers. But something that the Austria thing here said a second ago was that France's queen was Austria, and I don't know why they cut that off, because that's important information to remember. France, I believe it's King Louis XVI was the king of France that got beheaded by the crowd. His wife was Marie Antoinette, the notorious let them eat cake woman. She was Austrian. They had a marriage to form an alliance between France and Austria. Napoleon actually went up to marry an Austrian woman to make kind of a similar alliance. But Austria did have more of a reason than the other European countries to be upset, because you just guillotined our queen. You took her head off. Like, she was Austrian. She was Austrian royalty, and your people chopped their head off. This revolution cannot stand. It's radical. And I can see why in the first coalition specifically that Austria would see France as an existential threat. But anyway, let's get into it.
So France ended up at war with basically the rest of Europe.
Look at that
and the
map.
war of the First Coalition began. At first, France struggled, but then they started to do surprisingly well, and in many conquered territories, they began to establish sister republics, exporting their revolutionary ideas across Europe. In 1796, they planned a three-pronged attack to take Vienna and knock Austria out of the war, with two magnificent armies in the north to kick ass, and Napoleon in the south.
General Monroe, the one who's leading one of the two armies at the top, they were known as the Army of the Rhine. He actually has a very interesting history. He was close allies with Napoleon's future Marshal MacDonald, as well as he was implicated in a plot to actually take out Napoleon. I believe it happened around 1806 or 1805, where he was a part of a coup to take out Napoleon, despite helping Napoleon in the coup of 18 Brumaire and actually getting a major position in Napoleon's France after he became first consul and then later emperor. So General Monroe is actually a very interesting story. And then later on in the final wars of the coalition, I believe after Napoleon's invasion of Russia, he actually helped the coalition go to war against Napoleon in France. So he's a very interesting story if you ever have time to read up on General Monroe.
As a bit of a diversion, for the first time, Napoleon would lead a military campaign. This was his chance to prove himself, to be somebody. And what a general he proved to be. The army he was given were demoralized, lacking equipment, and underpaid. But Napoleon galvanized them with inspirational speeches, and he took them into Italy. He was outnumbered, and his campaign was partially meant to be a sideshow, but he made it the main show. While the two northern armies were being held back, Napoleon made staggering progress. In a signature Napoleon move, he masterfully split his enemies into two and took them on separately, knocking Sardinia out of the war and putting the Austrians on the run. At the famous Battle of Lodi, he was in the fray, aiming the cannons himself, getting covered in mud, and earning the total respect of his men. They respected him so much that when he ordered an almost suicidal assault on the only bridge in town, his men threw themselves at it and took it despite fierce Austrian resistance. For Napoleon, it was all he needed to confirm that he was the greatest human who had ever existed. Wow, Napoleon, you're pretty great at this military stuff. Just be careful your head doesn't get too big. What did you just say to me, you little prick? And as Napoleon swept through
Napoleon definitely had an
the
ego.
Italians cheered his arrival. Yes, I'm here to liberate you from your cruel Austrian oppressors and replace them with French ones.
Remember, it makes sense that the Italian crowds would be cheering Napoleon on here because Napoleon is essentially Italian. You know, being from the island of Corsica, I believe he actually spoke Corsican and maybe even Italian. So it would make sense that their citizens would see him as some sort of liberator when they're being ruled by a foreign country in Austria. Unfortunately, Napoleon, you know, like they said, replaced the Austrian oppressors with French ones.
Napoleon plundered as he went, sending riches back to France to help its economy, but also paying his men the first real money they'd seen in years. The Pope had been supporting the Austrians, so Napoleon briefly went to go give him a slap. And as he began to approach Vienna, the exhausted Austrians were forced to make peace, with Napoleon overseeing negotiations himself. He had just single-handedly knocked Austria out of the war.
Wow.
And by the way, he was only 28. So maybe it's about time you moved out of your dad's attic.
I'm 25 and I haven't done nothing like that yet, so we got a lot of catching up to do.
The Italian territories he had conquered, Napoleon established new French sister republics, even writing constitutions and organizing governments himself. Not something a general generally does. When he got back to France, he was hailed as a hero, and the extremely unpopular government were concerned he might get some power-hungry ideas. So they agreed he should go far away from France to Egypt, where he could maybe undermine British access to India. Napoleon was eager to win more glory, so he brought with him a team of scholars, and he was like, whoa, it's a freaky man-cat. Whoa, it's a big stick. Whoa, it's an ugly horse. Whoa, it's a stumpy little manlet. Hey, I'm actually average height for the time.
And he was too, he really was.
British Admiral Nelson came down and wrecked his fleet, and an Anglo-Ottoman force defeated him at Acre. So Napoleon abandoned his men and went back to France.
So something that they didn't address, actually, Napoleon's trip to Egypt, yes, it was politically motivated, but he was extremely excited to do it because this had been the land that one of his heroes, Alexander the Great, had previously conquered. Napoleon had ambitions to go all the way from Egypt to India to undermine the British and take all of that land over for France. And he might have actually been able to do it had Nelson not sunk his ships, because Napoleon's seen repeated success in Egypt. With the Battle of the Pyramids, he had a general, I believe his name was Kleber, who had 300 men versus 10,000, and he held out for over 10 hours in a square formation until Napoleon was able to come with an additional, or it was 1,500 men that Kleber had, and then Napoleon came in with an additional 2,500 and beat them all. And the Battle of the Pyramids is probably the most famous battle from Napoleon's expedition to Egypt. It's worth noting that Napoleon was a bit of a propagandist. The battle happened in sight of the pyramids, but it would be like saying that, let's say you live in a suburb 10 miles outside of the city and you're able to see some of the biggest skyscrapers in the main city, and you said that the battle happened in the main city, or you said that you lived in the main city. It was a little bit of propaganda. It didn't actually happen at the pyramids. Once again, contrary to what Ridley Scott's Napoleon movie showed, which, if you couldn't tell, I really don't like that movie, where Napoleon, for whatever reason in the movie, shoots a cannonball at the pyramid, which would make no sense because Napoleon was actually a major student of history. But I promise that'll be, actually, when they talk about the coup, I have one more thing to say about the movie. But if you want a full breakdown of everything that movie did wrong, history buffs did a phenomenal video breaking it down, comparing it to the Napoleon mini TV series that they made in the 2000s that I recommend you watch, and Waterloo the movie, which are all better. This oversimplified video with the crude animations and the comedy and the simplistic facts do a much better job of telling the story. For example, notice how they didn't mention Josephine here at all. Napoleon didn't leave because of Josephine. But the movie makes that the focal point, the center point. So, I don't know. I don't know what Ridley Scott was thinking.
His campaign in Egypt hadn't gone quite as planned. But one thing you should know about Napoleon was that he was a skilled propagandist.
Oh, yeah.
He published his own newspapers that sometimes exaggerated his achievements, and even commissioned paintings that generally made him look cool. So when he returned to Paris, he was yet again hailed as a hero, and he began to get some power-hungry ideas. First, however, he had a bit of a problem to deal with. See, he had learned something shocking about his dear wife. Really, Josephine? This guy? I'm just as tall as him. I'm sorry, I swear. Now that you're becoming famous, I'll never do it again. Make sure you don't. I've never stooped so low as to cheat on you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll be in this room consulting my generals for the next 30 minutes. And by consulting, I mean boinking. By my generals, I mean this woman. And by 30 minutes, I mean 2 seconds.
That actually is a true story. I remember the first time I watched this video way back when I first started it. Like, this video got me into Napoleonic history, but that tidbit always caught my attention. I'm like, no way that's actually true. It actually is a true story. And I'm not going to justify Napoleon cheating on his wife. Cheating and infidelity is wrong, and I believe that as a Christian. But to a certain extent, you got to understand why Napoleon did it, because his wife was cheating first, and it was public news in France, so Napoleon comforted himself with other women. Once again, doesn't make it right, but is there also a reason for it? Yes.
Dealt with his wife, Napoleon was then approached by a very influential politician who said he had an idea. He wanted to stage a coup against the deeply unpopular government and needed the extremely popular Napoleon's help. And Napoleon thought that was just the darn tootinest idea. The plan was to trap the government and convince them to voluntarily give up their power. And here's how they did it. Hey guys, oh my gosh, quick! There's a dangerous Jacobin plot to overthrow you, which we definitely aren't just making up. Better get inside this cage so we can protect you. Okay. Gentlemen, we got him. In this case, the cage was an isolated palace outside of Paris, with no one around but Napoleon and his army. With the government inside, Napoleon then entered, and a pretty chaotic event ensued, during which the government didn't seem entirely sure what was going on, Napoleon's men didn't seem entirely sure what was going on, and Napoleon himself didn't seem entirely sure what was going on. But thankfully, Napoleon's brother Lucien, president of the lower house, managed to regain control, and the remaining councilmen were intimidated into creating a new constitution. And thus, a new government.
The French government is very interesting, and you actually see some mirror reflections of what the American government is modernly known as. You had the Council of 500, and I believe the other one was called the Council of Ancients or the Council of Elders, which mimicked the House of Representatives and the Senate that we see today in the U.S. government. And then you had the executive branch, which was the Council of Five. The man who approached Napoleon, I believe you pronounce his name Emmanuel Joseph Sayes, approached Napoleon about a coup, and they worked together amongst a slew of other people to actually do the coup. Obviously, they oversimplified it, hence the whole point of the video. But the coup with Napoleon's brother was very interesting. Napoleon came to the Chateau de Saint Cloud, which they had tricked the government by telling them there was a Jacobin plot, or that the Parisians are partisans. I don't remember what you call the people of Paris, but obviously there had been a lot of head chopping, a lot of turmoil going on during the revolution. So it wasn't difficult to convince them that maybe something would go wrong if we do a monumental move on the government. In reality, that was actually to protect Napoleon and his fellow conspirators. So when it actually happened, Napoleon went into the two councils. He tried to regain control. He asserted himself. He said some very unwise things. He called himself the god of war and all sorts of things. And the council turned on him. They saw him as a tyrant. They started chanting Caesar at him and Cromwell. And Epic History has a great video covering the coup of 18 Brumaire. They have a lot of great Napoleonic content. I highly recommend you check it out. There's a fly in here. But I highly recommend that you check that out. But Lucien, after Napoleon went outside, after basically being beat up by the council, some of his men brought him outside, and there was a bunch of guards who were actually there to protect the two consuls that Napoleon wasn't in charge of. Napoleon was the military leader of the District of Paris, which was done in manipulation to stage the coup. But his men had a standoff with the men protecting the palace, protecting the consuls. And Lucien came outside, and he was the president of the Council of 500, I believe. He came outside and pointed a sword at Napoleon's neck and said, "If my brother does not honor the liberty of Frenchmen, I will strike him down," or something along those lines. And it won the guards that were protecting the consul over, and Napoleon and his men, led by Marshal Murat, probably the most notorious cavalry commander in the history of history, were led in, and he yelled, "Get this damn rabble out of here," and said, "Citizens, you are dissolved." And that was the end of the French government. Hence, now we have First Consul Napoleon.
Was formed, this time with 3 consuls in charge. But after Napoleon did some rewriting, in the end, there was really only one man in charge, the first consul, him. And over the next few years, he worked to consolidate even more power and essentially became a dictator in total control of France. And by the way, he was only 30, so maybe it's about time you watched the disgusting bedsheets. France was now ruled by possibly the greatest military leader of the time. Possibly the greatest? Or definitely? Well, now is his chance to prove it. See, back when Napoleon was still in Egypt, being Indiana Jones. Back home?
Oh, I didn't even mention that. Yeah, I'm thankful that they showed that. When Napoleon was in Egypt, he discovered the Rosetta Stone, which had writing in hieroglyphics, Greek, and I believe Latin, which allowed for the transcription of hieroglyphics to get massively expanded. And eventually the British took it after they conquered France and beat Napoleon, which is now why it sits in the British Museum. I believe it still is there to this day. But the entire field of Egyptology and hieroglyphics and learning about Egyptian history can partly be thanked to Napoleon and his crew for finding the Rosetta Stone. I believe they were digging fortifications outside of one of the cities when they were going into battle or going into defense for an upcoming battle, and they found the Rosetta Stone.
Being France. They had conquered even more territory, and they were like, "Hey Piedmont, you get revolutionary ideals. Hey Switzerland, you get revolutionary ideals. And Rome, you get revolutionary ideals. Everybody gets revolutionary Oh, hey guys, nice sledgehammers. And Naples, very cool nail gun. You guys here to get some revolutionary ideas?" As France was still spreading the revolution, and with Napoleon busy in Egypt, the European powers felt the time was right for round 2, and the war of the Second Coalition began. And this time, their big bad boy buddy Russia was here to bang some French boys back to Bordeaux. And bang them, they did. France got blasted. But then Russia pulled out after stalling in Switzerland, and now that Napoleon was in charge of the country, he was ready to start blasting right back. He took command of the Army of the Reserve, and he brought the fight to the Austrians. Now, there are many traits that made Napoleon a great military leader. I already mentioned one of them, how he was one of the boys and commanded the total loyalty of his men. But now we see a second reason, the element of surprise. In 1800, Napoleon moved to Geneva, and it looked like he was probably going to take on the Austrian forces in Germany. There's no way he'd be crazy enough to move his entire army south through the Alps as a surprise attack on the Austrians besieging Genoa. Oh, Napoleon's moving his entire army south through the Alps as a surprise attack on the Austrians besieging...
Like they mentioned, Napoleon had ambition. Nobody had crossed the Alps in a military campaign going all the way back to Hannibal in the Punic Wars of the Roman Empire versus the Carthaginians. So that's the type of history we're talking about Napoleon making.
Well, Napoleon's crossing of the Alps is legendary, and you may have seen one of the most famous paintings of the general, popping a sick wheelie on his majestic stallion surrounded by dangerous mountain terrain. Of course, in real life, he made the crossing on a depressed mule. But that's not as cool.
Propaganda,
When he emerged
baby.
in Italy, the Austrians expected him to come break their siege, but Napoleon went for their supply line near Milan, forcing the Austrians to meet Napoleon head-on at the famous Battle of Marengo. The Austrians initially clobbered the outnumbered French, and they were like, hooray, we won. But then a few hours later, Napoleon showed up again with an even bigger army, and he clobbered them right back. Holy cow.
One of Napoleon's generals that was with him in Egypt, his name was Louis de Say. He was basically the same age as Napoleon and probably would have been made a marshal in 1804 had he not passed away in the Battle of Marengo. Came back with more men and allowed Napoleon to do a counterattack on the Austrians. After the Austrians defeated Napoleon in battle, they essentially won the battle. But then they rested on their laurels, they got sloppy, they didn't pursue and destroy the enemy in the way that Napoleon did many of times to the armies he defeated. And that got them, they got them defeated. And yeah,
This tiny
solidified
little fun-sized French guy is
Napoleon's
running rings
position.
around us.
Hey! I'm average height for the time, you jerk!
Then, after General Moreau's victory at Hohenlinden, Vienna was exposed, and the Austrians again sued for peace. Just like the War of the First Coalition, the Second Coalition ended in another French victory. But in many ways, they both felt more like Napoleon victories.
2-zip Napoleon.
Only the UK remained at war with Napoleon, and they were using their powerful navy to blockade French ports and were even seizing the cargoes of neutral ships. Obviously, everyone else got pretty pissed off that the British were interfering with their trade, so in response, they formed a league, and they embargoed the UK right back. Neutral countries protecting their own interests? That's offensive. So Britain went to Copenhagen and blew a bunch of stuff up, and the League disbanded.
If you're looking for someone to blame as the aggressor in the wars of the coalition and the Napoleonic Wars, it's actually Britain. Because you could maybe understand why Austria would see France as a threat, but why did Britain see France as a threat? Just because they were expanding and winning wars that they didn't start? Like, what are they supposed to do? And unlike these other countries that are on the continent, Britain had already gone into a constitutional monarchy. The king didn't have ultimate power like they did in places like Russia with the Tsar or Austria with the emperor. It wasn't like that in Britain. So I don't know why Britain was so hell-bent on defeating Napoleon and destroying France. Because, and you could say, well, they were worried about the balance of power in Europe being erupted. Well, at that time, we didn't know the dangers of the balance of power. The two world wars didn't happen. The Franco-Prussian War didn't happen. Most of the Napoleonic Wars didn't happen. Nobody really knew what Europe would look like if there wasn't a balance of power. So I don't know why the British were so just determined to keep at war with France. And you're going to hear here that they did declare a peace treaty, but that lasted all of about a year.
UK's economy was pretty bust. They decided to sign a treaty with France in 1802. For the first time in a long time, Europe was at peace. Congratulations, sire. You've achieved peace. Yes, Pierre, but not for long. I still don't trust those dirty Brits. Did you hear they've been calling me the Bony Man? What does that even mean? Keep an eye on them, would you? I can't, sire. Why not? Because they use NordVPN. How would you like to spend...
We're gonna skip the ad, but let me just say I use NordVPN. I believe their code is oversimplified. Oh, what happened? I believe their code is oversimplified. I'm not sure if that still works, but I do highly recommend that you use NordVPN.
supporting my channel, so thank you. Now where were we? Oh yeah. Crossing the Alps, defeating the Austrians, and Europe at peace. What a meteoric rise it had been for the young Corsican. He had just taken charge of a nation that appeared to be losing a war and turned it all around, securing French gains in Europe. But there was now a big question. You see, throughout the chaotic French Revolution, French governments had struggled to keep the economy afloat. They often didn't have a whole lot of support, and they frequently came and went. Would Napoleon finally be the man who could stick around? Military victories were one thing, but could the general also govern?
Yup.
Spoiler alert. Yes.
Absolutely.
The economy's crumbling? Well, then why don't you have yourself a new national bank, currency reform, and improved taxation and welfare systems? The legal system is an incoherent mess? Well, then why don't we nicely wrap all those civil laws up into one new centralized legal code? Corrupt government.
And the Napoleonic Code actually is the basis for a lot of laws in many countries that still exist to this day. Napoleon's reforms fundamentally changed Europe in a way that could not be repaired and led to the revolutions in 1848 and basically led to Europe getting away from monarchies. Almost every country by the time you reach 1900, and then especially after World War I, their monarchy was completely dissolved and they were turned into either constitutional monarchies or just full-on republics and democratic republics. So you could thank the democracy, what would you call it? The republicization of Europe to Napoleon. Had Napoleon not spread these revolutionary ideals and made the Napoleonic Code and passed the reforms in the way he did and allowed France to continue spreading their influence, because without Napoleon at a certain point, the French government likely would have lost the war had it not been for the genius of Napoleon a lot sooner. But since they were able to stay on top for so long, it allowed France to spread these ideals. And once Napoleon lost and all this land went back, all the people were saying, hey, it was better under Napoleon. We had all these liberties and now these monarchies are back. They're taking them away. They're super corrupt. We can't accept this. So it led to another revolution in France in 1830, another revolution in France in 1848, which actually led to Napoleon's nephew getting put on the throne, as well as revolutions all across Europe.
Throw them in the trash. Bad infrastructure? Throw it in the trash. Women's rights? Throw them in the trash. Wait, really? Well, yeah, unfortunately, while Napoleon was building on the equality of the revolution, he also largely scaled back rights for certain groups, and husbands had full legal control over their wives. But come on, ladies, maybe let men have a slice of the pie for once, okay? Napoleon further reformed education, ensuring a system based on individual ability, meaning now Simeon had to compete with everyone else, and Napoleon could get the cream of the crop to help him run the republic. But he wasn't just building on the ideas of the revolution. The revolution had led to a lot of chaos, and Napoleon needed stability. So he rolled back a couple things, most notably with religion. The revolution had pretty much kicked the Catholic Church to the curb, but Napoleon understood that since many French citizens still considered themselves Catholic, that could be a problem. So he came to an agreement with the Pope and brought back the Church, only this time with some pretty hefty power limitations. He also ensured freedom for other religions, and is often noted for his positive treatment of Jewish people at a time of widespread anti-Semitism. But while all of this may make Napoleon sound like a pretty stand-up dude, it's good to note that he believed in religious freedom because he thought it was a powerful tool to keep the poor from eating the rich.
Which was a smart observation by Napoleon. And you, like he said, all of this stuff makes Napoleon seem like a pretty stand-up guy, which he was. You could criticize him for the way that he treated women's rights, but Napoleon had a prejudice against women likely due to his wife cheating on him. So he wanted men to have more control of their marriages. Once again, does that make it justified? No, absolutely not. But is there a reason for it? Absolutely. And his treatment of women and women's rights can be forgiven, considering that the other countries in Europe didn't even have the right to vote for most common people. Napoleon actually expanded on these ideas exponentially, despite not taking them all away. It was a big step in liberalism and republics in Europe.
Or something like that. Overall, Napoleon's aim was to end the chaos of the revolution and finally create a stable and prospering French republic. And in that aim, he seemed to be largely successful and generally popular with the people of France. He officially declared that the revolution is over, adding, "I am the revolution." Napoleon's head could be seen for miles.
Kind of right,
Not
though.
everyone was happy with Napoleon's reforms. Conservatives felt he was too radical. Radicals felt he was too conservative. But since Napoleon was a dictator, opposition could usually be stamped out with some good old-fashioned iron fisting. In 1804, Napoleon took one last major step. After some failed attempts were made to assassinate him, he wanted to strengthen his position and ensure his dynasty could live on after him. And so he decided being first consul for life simply wasn't quite enough. He decided he should become emperor. He held
So imagine you're Napoleon, right? And you're the best leader in Europe. You are the best leader in Europe. You're the most liberal leader. You're the one that's allowing people to have the most freedoms. You have the best policy. Your country is prospering. Every other country is constantly targeting you, most notably Britain, and they're just determined to see you fall. And you have attempts on your life made. There's, all this turmoil. Making yourself emperor and wanting your legacy being the right legacy, the one that history will see better than these other leaders to live on, is a justified solution in the context of what is going on. Once again, did Napoleon go too far as emperor after his coronation here? Absolutely. The invasion of Russia, Peninsular War, all the stuff I mentioned before. He took it too far. But at the time, Napoleon becoming emperor, not a crazy idea. And yes, the vote for him to become emperor was rigged. It was a rigged vote, but even if it hadn't been rigged, I predict it was highly likely that Napoleon still would have won the vote.
Asking the French people if they were cool with the idea, and they returned a definitely not rigged 99.9% in favor. The balls on this man. And so on the 2nd of December, 1804, in an elaborate ceremony at Notre Dame, Napoleon was made emperor. The Pope was even invited to attend, and normally he would crown an emperor, but to make sure everyone knew this wasn't some Charlemagne-style circular power division, Napoleon lifted the crown and placed it on his own head. Like I said, the balls on this
What
man.
a G.
He was now Emperor of the French. Well, Napoleon, you were a general, then you became first consul for life, and now you're an emperor. Is it enough yet? Is your ambition finally satisfied? I don't know, Pierre. What comes after emperor? I would say God, sire. You want to be a god? Yes. I'll put it down under maybe. Okay, everyone. What the hell is going on?
He absolutely
This Corsican
had
guy
an ego.
showed up out of nowhere, and he's kicking our ass. He's exporting the ideas of the French Revolution wherever he goes, and he just declared himself king of Italy and emperor. He can't do that. I'm the emperor. Oh, hey, fellow monarchs. I see you're having a monarch party. My invite must have got lost in the mail. I'll just set up a spot right here. Wow. You don't belong here, Napoleon. We're coming to take you down. I'd like to see you try. Oh, I'm so scared I just pooed my pants. Hey, everyone. I just pooed my pants. No, but I did just poo my pants. Before Napoleon had even declared himself emperor, the British had already redeclared war on France because both sides had been violating their previous treaty. Napoleon immediately occupied Hanover and then began making plans for a great British invasion, partially paid for by selling a huge chunk of land to the United States.
Yep, Napoleon did the
gathered his
Louisiana
army
Purchase
along
for
the
all my
English
Americans.
Channel. But here was the problem. While Napoleon's powerful army would almost certainly obliterate the British on land, there was very little chance he'd actually make it across the Channel, because Britannia ruled the waves. This power dynamic would keep the two traditional enemies from engaging in much real direct combat throughout the Napoleonic Wars. However, the British had something else up their sleeve: copious amounts of money. They were willing to throw cash at anyone who would go to war against Napoleon, and there were plenty of takers. Austria, Russia, Naples, and Sweden, hoping to put Napoleon's France back in its place, formed the Third Coalition against France.
See, once again, can you blame Napoleon for this war? This is the first war, the War of the Third Coalition, that's actually known as a Napoleonic War. And yes, like they said, Britain and France were both violating the treaties. But why did all these other countries get involved? They had nothing to do with it, but they just wanted to put Napoleon's France back in its place. Even though Napoleon was a monarch at this point, they still didn't like the freedoms that were being spread to the French people. And in my opinion, they likely did it, number one, because the British bribed them, so they did it for money. And number two, they did it because they were so afraid of losing any ounce of power.
Coalition forces probably thought that this time they stood a chance. They weren't prepared for the total humiliation they were about to suffer. The War of the Third Coalition was Napoleon at his best.
Oh, yeah.
We've already learned two ways in which Napoleon was a great military commander, but here comes one of the biggest reasons: speed. He had reorganized his army into corps, which were themselves basically small armies.
And you still see this system being used. That's why they call it the U.S. Marine Corps. Napoleon invented the corps system. People don't realize how much Napoleon actually contributed to history. But anyway, let's let them
Each had their own infantry, cavalry, and artillery, and as a result, was able to act more independently. They spread out through the countryside, and by living off the land rather than relying on heavy supply trains, they were able to move extremely quickly. Napoleon would traverse massive distances, outmaneuver his enemies, isolate them, and then move in for the kill before they even knew what was going on. Lightning warfare leading to total destruction. Would you like to see him do it? Here we go. Part of the coalition's plan was for the Russians to meet up with the Austrians and take on Napoleon together. Combined, they could turn the tide against him, so Napoleon needed to stop them from ever meeting. But he's all the way over in Boulogne. No problem. In a matter of weeks, Napoleon marched 200,000 men, in secret, encircling Austrian General Mack and capturing his entire army. A devastating blow. Napoleon later...
You can barely... That quote.
I have destroyed the Austrian army by simply marching.
What a G. You can call the Battle of Ulm a battle, but that's only really the Austrians desperately trying to escape after Napoleon basically destroyed them by doing nothing. The Battle of Ulm is one of the most lopsided military battles in the history of the world. Wasn't even remotely close. Napoleon outmaneuvered them so badly.
Next, he turned to face the approaching Russians. Okay, it looks like the French are coming for us, but check this out. I've got an amazing idea. When they approach, we run away. Sir, you're a genius.
Smartest
the
thing you
Russians
can
began
do.
to retreat with Napoleon giving chase, and since his tactics relied on quick victories, this could be a problem, especially because the longer the war went on, the more likely it looked other countries may join the coalition against him. But Napoleon knew the Russian Tsar, Alexander I, was young and seeking glory, so he came up with an idea to lure him in. He sent him a message. What does it say? It says, "Hello, I'm just a little baby boy, and I'm very scared." Are you talking like that, or is he? He is, sir. Why is he doing that? I don't know, but it's very cute, helpless, and vulnerable. A little baby boy, eh? Very scared, eh? Cute, eh? Boris, get my crossbow.
Emperor Alexander was a little bit of an idiot. For this tactic to work, Napoleon did a great job reading his opponent when it came to this scenario, because even when you look at the Congress of Vienna after Napoleon was overthrown, Emperor Alexander almost caused another war with the European powers over Poland and over a bunch of other issues where he basically was acting like a child. One day he was the greatest person who ever lived, a match for Napoleon. The next day he was a religious person. The next day he was a tyrant. Emperor Alexander was reckless, to say the least.
We're going hunting. The Allied forces turned to face Napoleon, who they now believed was in a vulnerable position. He was set up at Austerlitz, and to make it look like he was retreating, he had even evacuated the high ground. A thick fog set in, obscuring Napoleon's center, as the Allies took the bait and set up on the heights. From there, they spotted Napoleon's very weak-looking right flank, and they descended the heights to go get it. Little did they know, it was exactly what Napoleon was hoping
If
to do.
Napoleon's
The
right
next thing they
flank
knew,
is
a
weak,
large French force was emerging
he
from the
wanted it
fog,
that way.
launching a huge central assault up the hill. They swung around, crushing the Allies, and as men attempted to flee across the frozen lakes, Napoleon ordered his artillery to fire on the ice, causing an unknown number to drown. But he told me he was just a
What a destruction. What a destruction. And I know they obviously say that it's not as much as Napoleon's propaganda did. And that's something you see with the Battle of the Pyramids, with him crossing the Alps, with this Battle of Austerlitz. The propaganda over-exaggerates it, but the only reason he's able to over-exaggerate it is because it's partly true. He didn't take out thousands of men that were fleeing across the frozen lake, but it was hundreds. The Battle of the Pyramids didn't happen at the pyramids, but it was within sight of the pyramids. Him crossing the Alps, yeah, he can make it look cool. It wasn't on this horse, it was on a mule, but he still crossed the Alps. So Napoleon, even though he was a propagandist, his achievements are still so great, and this is why he's remembered in history the way that he is.
baby boy. What happened? He tricked you, sir. You mean I was the little baby boy all along? It was Napoleon's masterpiece.
Wow.
And Austria were once again forced to make peace with France. Then, with the French conquest of Naples in 1806, the War of the Third Coalition ended as yet another Napoleon victory.
3-zip
This
Napoleon.
was the third time Napoleon had to give Austrian Emperor Francis a good spanking. And so,
Oh, Francis
with the peace treaty in
II. Sorry about
1805,
that.
Napoleon was determined to punish him. He was forced to give up territory, hand over significant compensation, and promised never to fight Napoleon again. For now, Russia, Sweden,
Austria would
and the
break
UK
that promise
remained
later
at war
on.
with France, but none were able to offer much of a threat. And so, Napoleon got to work strengthening his grip over Europe. He gave out rule of captured territories to his family and friends, and most notably, he established a new confederation in Germany, with himself as its protector. Seeing his influence in Germany being wiped away, Emperor Francis acknowledged reality and officially dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, an entity that had existed.
There's a great quote that exists where they discuss the Holy Roman Empire, and they say the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. The Holy Roman Empire, yes, Napoleon dissolved it, and that should be noted, but it was basically a crumbling entity anyway. Had it not been for Napoleon, the Holy Roman Empire wouldn't exist today. It wouldn't have existed 100 years ago. It was something that needed to go. It was redundant.
For over 1,000 years. But it wasn't all good news for Napoleon. For one thing, Spain had earlier allied with France in 1804 because the British just couldn't help themselves from blowing up Spanish ships, and Napoleon hoped a combined French-Spanish fleet would eventually be able to invade England. Unfortunately, he received word that British Admiral Nelson had engaged his fleet at Trafalgar. Normally, naval battles looked like this, but in this case, Nelson did this. Was it because he was an idiot? No. It's because he was a genius. He successfully punched through the Franco-Spanish line and unleashed hell. His victory ensured British control of the sea, and his death during the battle made him a legend. Napoleon's hopes for a future British invasion were gone.
His plan to invade Britain might have actually worked, but the same way that Napoleon was innovating tactics on land and he was far ahead of his time and better than everybody else, Nelson was exactly that on the sea. And in his victory, like they said, Britain remained the dominant naval power all the way up to the naval arms race in World War I that they were still able to win 100 years later. So you could argue Horatio Nelson had a longer military impact than Napoleon because his victory there set the course for World War I, World War II, and the entirety of the remaining British Empire up until after World War II.
But not just that. Napoleon was also hoping to secure peace on the continent, but that wasn't looking likely because the Prussian king was under pressure from his wife. Frederick, he's established a confederation in our turf, and he told us he'd give us Hanover, but then offered it to the British. You have to declare war on him. What is it with you and war? What is it with you and being a cupcake? Go to war! Okay. In October
Somewhat
1806,
accurate.
Prussia,
Pretty accurate.
with its famed military tradition, joined the coalition and declared war, beginning.
Remember, Prussia did have a very dominant military position. And for those of you who don't know what Prussia is, it basically ended up becoming the German Empire. And what we modernly know as Germany. As you can see, the borders are a lot different because it includes lots of parts of Poland and other countries. The borders were very different back then. As you can tell, Europe looks almost nothing like this now besides Russia, the Nordic countries, France, the UK, of course. But Frederick the Great was somebody that Napoleon looked up to a lot. And Napoleon didn't actually want to go to war with Prussia because he knew their famed military experience. But the army had gone downhill a little bit. It wasn't even close, the Fourth Coalition.
War of the Fourth Coalition. Unfortunately, Prussian King Frederick William III wasn't the smartest tool in the shed. Look at him over there, being all
He was
French.
labeled a
Makes me
dumbass
sick.
in the tool
Boys,
shed.
we'll get him this time. But here's the thing. This time, we have to stick together. Do not under any circumstances face Napoleon by yourself. You all saw what happened to Austria. Hey, where'd Fred go? Hey, you jerk. Think you're some kind of big shot? Huh? Want to tangle with Fred? You don't got the cojones. We're screwed. Without consulting its allies, Prussia had gone ahead and sent Napoleon an ultimatum, demanding he move all his forces out of Germany. Now, some of you watching this video probably can't even wipe your own bum yet, but even you know, you don't just send Napoleon an ultimatum. Obviously, Napoleon went in for the kill. Prussia's army was quite outdated, so when they met Napoleon at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt, it wasn't even close. Even Marshal Davout's heavily outnumbered corps at Auerstedt sent the Prussians running, and Napoleon carried out...
So Jena was the battle Napoleon was at, and he faced a Prussian rear guard where he actually had the numbers advantage. So, of course, Napoleon, even when he didn't have the numbers advantage, still managed to win tons of battles in Italy and in the Third Coalition, amongst other wars. But Marshal Davout winning the Battle of Auerstedt, he faced the main Prussian army with I believe he had less than half of the men that the Prussians had, and still sent them running. Still absolutely dominated the battle. And it was a costly win for Davout. He lost over a quarter of his men. They were casualties. But at the end of the day, he still won the battle. And that made Davout one of Napoleon's best marshals. And that is one of the greatest military victories of all time. And once again, it proves the point that I made earlier, that France was able to win these wars not just because of the military genius of Napoleon, but also because they had this meritocracy that allowed these marshals to rise to these positions of power, as opposed to the other countries that just had their royalty sitting on top in these positions.
Ruthless pursuit of his fleeing enemy, taking Berlin and within a single month decimating the Prussian forces. Frederick William and the remnants of his army moved to the east. At this point, Napoleon's forces were pretty tired. Winter had come and conditions were miserable. He anticipated both sides would settle into winter quarters, but Russia decided to try their hand at an unexpected winter attack. A series of brutal battles followed that took a heavy toll on both sides, including the vicious Battle of Eylau, fought in blizzard conditions. Men froze to death, and many deserted. The Russian artillery tore the French to shreds, and Napoleon himself was momentarily under risk of being captured. In the end, the French army was saved thanks to a legendary cavalry charge by Napoleon's flamboyant cavalry commander,
Murat looked pretty badass
After the
there.
horror inflicted on both sides, they decided it might be a good idea not to do any more fighting until after winter. Then, after winter came, and the fighting continued. The Russians were pushed back to Friedland, where Russian General Bennigsen made a bit of a blunder by positioning himself with the Aller River to his back. The French artillery were able to pin the Russians between the river and their concentrated gunfire, a major element in Napoleon's fighting style, and many Russians drowned as they tried to escape. War of the Fourth Coalition. Victory, Napoleon.
4-zip Napoleon. Hopefully tomorrow I will have part 2 uploaded. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Let me know what you learned in the comments below, and hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Also, let me know if the face cam's too big, if I talk too much. This is a new format for me, so I would love any sort of feedback on it. And I will see you all in the next video. Peace out.